Hey everyone, so here's the second video, the second introduction video that I'm doing, and again I'm sharing my screen with you so you can see sort of what I'm talking about. This particular group of notes, there's 3 pages to this PDF, are notes I took, and I've used, because I was like, okay, let me just try to write some of this down. So I'm actually putting these up for you so you can have them. So one of the things we want to talk a little bit about first is this is compositions and type review continuation. So this is composition. So you want to start thinking about sort of composition, right? How you arrange things on a page, how we use the space, how we create contrast, how we create hierarchy in particular. Hierarchy, what order are you putting the elements in your page or the space on your page to help a reader, to direct a reader how you engage with this, right? Whether that be a simple message or simple content, or whether it's very intricate, layered, many different layers of information that you're trying to organize. So how do you help the reader or the viewer engage with this material? And again, think about this whether you're doing print or whether you're doing digital work, whether you're doing a book, whether you're doing posters, whether you're doing a website, whether you're doing an app, whether you're working on question mark, right? You're coming up with the newest thing, right? And as grad students, I think one of the things you want to start thinking about is how you create that new kind of work, right? So one of the things I do here is sort of break this down to sort of like 3 things. So there's sort of traditional composition, right? You start with a page, right? You will see this very traditional page that has this proportion of 1:1 to 2:3, right? About 2/3 of the page is full, usually is one column. If you look at, for example, books from the 15th, 16th, 17th century, you will see this. It's based on the golden circle, the Fibonacci sequence, classical proportions. There's only one column, it's just columns of text, right? In some illuminated manuscripts, you'll see very ornate starter caps, right? So think about how that creates a hierarchy. So the golden circle Fibonacci you would see a lot of the times is this sort of like this shape going around, this nautilus shape a lot. Here's a broken up square. So it feeds into a square within a square within a square. You can break it up into 2/3. So that proportion of 2/3 tends to be really exciting for a lot of design, right? So working with odd numbers, 2/3 of something rather than half, right? Half tends to get into you putting things in the middle, you center things, which is very common that we like to do. Our natural inclination is to go to the middle, but not always the most exciting place to start to place items, or for example, letter forms in a composition as you're thinking of your covers. A lot of photographers tend to use this, what we call the rules of thirds, which is a variation of this. Notice that it's sort of, if you have an iPhone and you put a grid on your photo app, you will see this is what you get. It's this rules of thirds. It's very classical. So that means that the point of interest to put the key element of your composition will be where lines cross, right? So that's why I marked these, right? So this is where the tension lies. So if you put things, so imagine if you have 3 elements and you put one here, here, and here, then you start using scale. So one of them gets larger, so therefore that tells you what that alerts the eye towards the hierarchy. If everything's the same size, then you start thinking, wait, where do I go, right? So you're trying to create tension, contrast, right? Then we started to move towards sort of grids and organizational structures. The international style. This came out of Switzerland, Germany. This very rigid mathematical way of creating modules. Look at this, right? To help you organize things, right? Very 60s Swiss style. There's a rationale. Later on in the semester, you're going to read a piece by Joseph Müller-Brockmann, who's probably one of the most famous designers who use this Swiss style to generate a whole body of work, right? It became in many ways a methodology, a system from which we could use to design a lot. This is sort of considered modernism, right? Now you want to start thinking how these ways of organizing the information, of arranging these grids, if you will, how they express the content best. How do you work? Start thinking about that, right? Or do you mix these? Do you create work where these get mixed, right? For example, I tend to do a lot of this traditional book form, but actually bring in the organizational structure of a grid, because a grid helps you to organize things, especially if you have multiple voices within a page or a space, multiple kinds of content, right? Imagine how many different kinds of content you can have on a page or a spread of a book, right? So let's go to the second page, and again, we're covering more composition. So start thinking that again, our natural inclination is to go right to the middle, right? If you go take it to the rules of thirds, which is a variation of Fibonacci, you start to see where you place things where there's tensions where lines cross. But imagine if you start to play with geometric forms, right? A triangle, a circle, a square, sort of the basic tenets of the Bauhaus. If you put them all together, you're still not getting that much, right? If you start to move them around and start to see what can happen, you start to see, okay, there's contrast between the shapes, so you're starting to get at something. There's some movement, tension going on. And what happens if you start playing with scale? So now you're starting to get tension, right? They're not centered. There's a particular, you want me to go here, here, and here. Actually, these two are a little about the same size, so that's my mistake. But imagine if you start to play with the size of these two, right? So you're starting to tell the reader, I want you to look here first. You're starting to help the reader navigate the composition that you're generating, right? You want to start thinking of your composition. What is your hook, right? What is the first element that you hook the reader? What is the first character? What is the first form, right? In this class, we're working with typography only. So what is it, right? If you start thinking of those illuminated manuscripts, the hook was those very ornate letter forms, the huge B that dripped down beautifully, like with beautifully done calligraphy, right? So if you start thinking, I'm using geometric forms here, think of using letter forms. What would happen if you were using letter forms, right? So start thinking in terms of your composition of the forms. And again, letter forms are form. They're not just letters, right? If you didn't speak English, those letter forms would not be, you wouldn't know what they are. They're just little pictures to you. So start to think about the relationship between type and image, image and type, right? Think of scale, right? Large to small. Think of the weight of something, the heaviness, the boldness, right? Think how you use space. Think how you use direction, and think how you use texture within a composition, right? So all these elements together help to create a really beautiful, flowy, energetic, expressive composition. And even if the subject matter or the content that you have is incredibly just basic stuff, you still can generate really exciting compositions out of that with your typography. So some basic things that I also want you to keep in mind. Okay, so we're going to think a lot about the hierarchy. What's the hook? What's 1, 2, 3, 4, right? So how do you detail it? Think about the composition and how to generate tension, right? I usually talk about odd number of elements, right? Think about how you use scale and size, right? And texture to help with that, right? Think of the contrast, okay? Look closely for details. Typography is about detail and precision, how you control the space, how you control the relationship between one element and the other, right? What's the relationship between that large letter versus that small body copy? What is in between, right? Think about that when you're setting body copy. Usually 60 to 70 characters per line is maximum. We get tired when we read longer than 60, so that means that the smaller your type size is, you need to keep that in mind. The larger your type size is, of course, you're going to get less characters per line, so think about that. Be clear and explicit on your contrast, larger versus smaller. For example, some people would do type size 12 for the body copy and type size 16 for the heading. Let's play more explicit contrast, right? 12-point type, I alluded to this, right? Tends to be Microsoft Word dictated this to us, right? And it became a standard. It became sort of a preordained rule that we follow, which is really not a rule. Actually, 12-point type in a lot of typefaces is what we call very horsey, very awkward, looks too large. So you want to start to play a little bit with generating very refined type, right? So between A and 10, a lot of people say this is very contemporary designers, that we tend to do 8 to 10-point type size, that is too small. take a look at most magazines and most newspapers, the type size is anywhere between 8 and 10. And of course, that depends on the typeface itself and how it was designed and how the space is in it and how the designer of the letter forms figured out the weight and what kind. For example, the type size of the letter of characters in a newspaper, because of the columns in the newspaper, have to be very precise. So you're trying to get the most words in the column width. So think about that. Letting, right, the space between the lines. Why is it too open? Why is it so tight? It's a visual thing. What's comfortable for the reader, for the viewer, based on what you are interpreting the text, based on what you're wanting the text or the composition to achieve, right? So think about that, right? Tight letting tends to be difficult to read sometimes, so you want to be careful that the letters don't crash, right? The descenders from the top line don't crash the ascenders from the bottom line, right? And if you're doing it, is there a conceptual reason why you're doing it? Think about that, right? Think about letter spacing, the space between the letters. Why is it so much, right? Can you control that so that you perhaps, for example, get really good rags? Those, if you're doing unjustified type, ragged right, and you have that edge on the right hand side that moves around, you want that to be comfortable, right? Rags, even left ragged, be careful, make them, it's a natural way that we read when you do rags, left to right, right? Justified type in many ways is unnatural for us to read. Our eye likes to do the little swooping around, but you want to be careful what those rags look like. And there's the typographic detailing lecture, we're going to cover it a lot more. Start thinking about your hang line, where on your composition is there that line. I also think about it sometimes as an axis for the top where things from that line hang down. If you think of a page and you draw an axis up at the top that's horizontal, going horizontal across, that's sort of all the content hangs from there. And if you had a multiple page publication, that hang line tends to be the same throughout, so the reader understands that's the top. You drop their eye down. Think of your usages of dumb quotes versus smart quotes. Again, smart quotes are curled on serif faces. They're usually angled in sans serifs. Dumb quotes, when you use for text, usually are feet and inch marks. So keep that in mind. And I want you to start thinking about the denotative qualities, right? The pragmatic way that you're designing like think about designing in a denotative way, pragmatic. It gives the information versus connotative. You're being expressive about it. Start thinking about how you express the content, right? Really think about that and the relationship that you have to the content, to the material. Okay, so this was some lecture videos that I've set up to get you going. There's further videos. If you look down on Blackboard, further down, there's more videos that you can look at from Learning.com, and you should look at them to help you review and organize things. Great, I will see you soon.